Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics podcast. So, Michelle, today before we jump into our auto downcoding, I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the webinar events that I have coming up in a joint, really collaboration with my good friend Terry Fletcher at Terry Fletcher Consulting. So, I've gotten a lot of questions. So, those that are watching this on video, I'm just going to show you the website really quick where you can access the different events, sign up for those. Each of these, the live event will have one CEU. So that's definitely going to be a positive if you're looking for that additional opportunity to get those CEUs. When you go to this website, it's stephanieallardconsulting.com/webinar events. You'll see our schedule for the whole year just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. And the first one coming up is February 18th, and that's going to be on split, shared, and incident to services. And Michelle, I always kind of laugh when we talk about that because it's something that we constantly think that everybody should know, but yet every single time we audit that, we see a problem with it. So
Exactly. It's a topic that can never get enough attention, in my opinion, just
yep,
because it is widely misunderstood about
yep.
what keeps that compliant. So I think it's an excellent topic to kick off the year with, just as a reminder and for people to be doing their review.
Yes. And one other reminder as well, if you're interested in what we have going on throughout the year, if you purchase 3 webinars, then one of those will be free. So you'll essentially get 2 for the price of 3. And again, live events will have those CEUs, so that'll be
You
a
mean
plus.
3 for the price of 2?
Yes, thank you. It's funny that I needed to be corrected because you know how many times that when we were getting this ready, Terry kept saying, "No, you got to say it this way or say it that way. This is what this means." Apparently, I still don't have that down. But yes, you will get 3 for the price of 2 if you buy those up front. So take a look at what we have over there. We're pretty excited. As always, we will do a deep dive and talk about how to implement that into your organization. So, not
Mhm.
just a quick flyby of the rules. We're going to talk about real world examples and what to do with it from there because most of us know what those things are. We just need to know how to implement those.
Absolutely. And for sure, anything from you and Terry is going to be extremely informative and quality content. So, something people should really be considering tuning into these different webinars.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So we've had a lot of feedback on our topic already on LinkedIn related to E&M auto downcoding. And this is one as well where I'm getting a lot of questions from my clients, from some of the members that I have, where it's becoming this battle because of all of the administrative burden. So
Hmm.
I want to talk about this in stages where we'll go through ways to identify this and then also talk about what this means from a workflow perspective. But let's break this down first as to what people are noticing. And, I fear, Michelle, that we're going to have some people out there that are going to be surprised and
Hmm.
probably go back and look at their claims data and see that this sort of thing is happening to them as well, and they just didn't realize it.
Absolutely. Because this is something that is not going to be like a denial, it's not going to be obvious. It's just going to be this silent change to the payment that you receive for the service that's sent in. So, it's definitely going to be something that I think people are going to be caught off guard by.
Mhm.
And how much you want to bet it's going to start being noticed when those providers who, as we know, lots of facilities base compensation for their providers on RVUs, and how much you want to bet that it's going to stick out like a sore thumb when things
Yeah.
like that start getting analyzed for the year. So it's really important not to let it get that far. Um, there's things you're going to want to put in place, but This isn't something that is, in my opinion, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, this isn't something that's going to improve compliance. It's really, it's just what it says. It's automatic. If we think about compliance, why isn't there some type of record review? They're
Mhm.
just based on some algorithm, some um, diagnosis coding because it's claims data. And
Right.
I'm sure that certain data elements such as the um, the specialty type and things like that are also going to be put into factors as well. So it's not something that's going to magically fix compliance concerns. If anything, it could create compliance concerns through technically undercoding. You know,
Right.
think about it from that way. So the oversight of this is so important and it needs to be something that is looked at right now. Don't wait until you identify it as an issue and take this very seriously.
Mhm. And to give a little more context there to what Michelle's referring to, so when the payers are auto downcoding, meaning that say that your practice is billing out a level 5 or you've billed out a level 4 and that gets down to coded 1 or 2 levels of service. What Michelle's referring to is you're not always going to see that as this big, claims rejection or claims
Mhm.
denial. And a lot of times, what I'm finding is that this is showing up in typically one of two ways from what I'm hearing and seeing. So, one of them is where the payer will identify on the remittance letter that, say, a level 5 was billed and they changed it to a level 3. Other times, what's happening is they will just adjust the payment amount and they don't change the CPT code that you see on that remittance letter. So that makes it even more difficult because you would have to know your practice information so well that you understand that the reimbursement you're looking at is your negotiated fee schedule for a lower visit than it typically would be for that 5. And this is where I'm finding that we're going to have a lot of issues because already there's so many clients that I work with when they, outsource billing, for example. Again, let's talk about the difference between onshore and offshore. A lot of onshore companies are fully aware of this. They're paying attention. They are trying to, talk to their practices about it, be diligent with appeals, things like that. But when we have all of these different companies that are either offshore or they're just not paying attention to the back end. There's so
Mhm.
many times we have billing companies that just want to get it out the door, then they write stuff off. This type of thing is going to be missed because a lot of times practices that function in that way and outsource their billing want to be hands off. And that's really, the beginning of the end for those groups and revenue because you don't know what's happening, you don't have an explanation. And this really requires an active plan in place from a workflow perspective to make sure that your team is tackling this so you're not missing out on this revenue.
Absolutely.
Now, Michelle, one thing that I find interesting, and I try to sit back and rack my brain on this because I haven't seen anything out there that definitively defines for us what's wrapped up into this algorithm on the payer side. But if we take a step back and we think about this logically with what we know about the industry, I think where this is coming from, to some extent, if we think about our physician and practitioners' NPI numbers, built within that NPI number is going to be telling the payers specialty, for example. And with
Mhm.
the way that they are able to compute things nowadays, my guess is that that's going to be running up against these algorithms that are showing, basically utilization. So when we
Mhm.
used to get like the cert notifications that you're an outlier compared to your peers, that type of thing can happen much more quickly. And I would assume that that's driving some of this. But in addition to that, one of the trends I'm seeing is definitely related to diagnoses. And to me, this is a hard one because as an educator, as an auditor, this is an area where we've always struggled because
Hmm.
there's either been situations where, even prior to ICD-10, people were not focusing enough on the specificity. We had all of those warnings when ICD-10 was implemented that you had to be more specific or claims were going to be denied. We've seen that type of denial activity over the past 2 years for sure. But now I'm also seeing a step further than that, that when these unspecified codes or symptoms and things like that are used, as opposed to something that is much more specific to that patient encounter that I can even see in the notes, I'm noticing that a lot of that is driving the times when these levels are being downcoded.
So you're saying if they're using like unspecified, for example, when
Yeah.
something more specific would definitely be known by the
Yeah.
provider.
So I just looked up as an example. I've been working with a couple of different rheumatology practices recently over this particular issue. And one of the trends that's being seen in rheumatology is a lot of our physicians and practitioners want to use the diagnosis M25.50, which actually reflects pain in unspecified joint. And we see it used a lot. But,
Yeah.
another thing I thought of with this is that if you go even a step further, if you remember back when ICD-10 was implemented, a lot of the developers and the vendors of the EMR companies thought they were doing our providers a favor by essentially creating their own language, right?
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is their own code descriptor. And this particular one, the M25.50, is one that comes to mind for me because not only are we seeing auto downcoding activity, but this is very commonly one where inside of a billing or an EMR system that then transfers to the billing, the practice management, it has a whole different meaning. So when our providers are
Hmm.
searching and doing, everything from a pick list, if
Yeah.
that doesn't say unspecified pain, unspecified joint, and they're seeing pain in multiple joints, which a lot of them
Yes.
do see that.
That's what they use it for, in all honesty. When I see that, you see in the diagnosis that's been blown in from the EMR, pain in multiple joints. And it's like, well,
Right,
this is not what this, it may be able to be used for that, but it's not saying what you think it says.
right, right. And then on top of that, a lot of the times the patients do have definitive diagnoses.
Hmm.
So they have, rheumatoid arthritis, they have osteoarthritis, they have a lot of other underlying conditions that can commonly come with that. And it's not really showing that appropriate picture,
Hmm.
but with certain specialties, there's definitely the argument that diagnosis coding is a lot more difficult. And that's going to happen with things like rheumatology, orthopedics, my absolute favorite, OBGYN. Not those are that entire section is just like, oh gosh, when you got to dig into that O section, it is not fun in
I
the
know.
diagnosis manual. Um, but when we think about that, it's going to be more difficult. And there's so many times we will see, for example, in NextGen, years ago working with a rheumatology group, I had to constantly come back with feedback on my auditing that they were just blowing in the diagnoses because similar to what Epic and other systems allow, they would have a section, whether it's related to the assessment and plan or to laboratory orders, for example, where they could click a button and then all of the conditions would be blown in. And I bring that up because all of these things are going to be heavily playing into the fact that you could be, causing your own issues when we're looking at auto downcoding.
Hmm.
Now, I don't think, and Michelle, you let me know what you think, I don't think this is something that can be avoided at this point.
Mm-mm.
And I do think we should be clear that just because you put a definitive diagnosis doesn't then mean that you're going to skirt around auto downcoding. But this is something that I'm seeing as a massive trend where this could be improved greatly to see, okay, does this make a difference?
Absolutely. And I agree because while we don't know much about what's driving the auto downcoding, we do know we can just use some common sense to know what is on the claim, and that is the diagnosis codes. And so I know you and I have both run into this where doing audits, people don't, or they haven't in the past, put a whole lot of emphasis on the accuracy of diagnosis coding. And that just is no longer an option, especially, with the value based
Mm-hmm.
reimbursement um, payments and things like that, and now how it could potentially impact auto downcoding. It just isn't an option anymore to skirt over that. And I know you have worked with different clients before in that area where you have identified that it's not the provider necessarily causing the issue, it's what's in the system, and they need to stop having all of these different definitions for this one code. It needs to say what it means if that's being pulled into the note, because I think you and I both know a provider would see um, pain and unspecified joint, and they would not associate that when they're trying to identify pain in multiple joints.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I just was looking up because I was trying to remember the word gems was coming to mind. That was right. So back when we had the transition in 2015, which is just crazy. So over 10 years now, when we had the transition to ICD-10, we did have what was called GEMS, which was a general equivalence mapping, and it was developed by CMS. But some companies, meaning the developers, took that a step further. Some of them used the gems that were there, meaning that CMS gave guidance as to what that crosswalk looked like. And I remember back then we had different tools that would help. And, say we had something that was unspecified, like hypertension, we had one option. And then it would show you, okay, now in ICD-10, you've got 5 or 10 options or however many. So those things exist, but there's so many times that I've done audits, and I haven't seen this as much over the past 2, maybe 3 years. So I'm hoping a lot of this has been turned off and changed. But there were things that had gotten so messy because they would try to take, for example, that one hypertension diagnosis and then make the new 5 to 10 options display the same language so the providers wouldn't be confused. And it's like, okay, you've just created a complete dumpster fire. And
Hmm.
then, we're all left to deal with it. Now, with things like risk adjustment, we've definitely seen denials that are just based on a misuse of ICD-10 guidelines, not following
Hmm.
that properly, putting a symptom when there's a definitive diagnosis. I've seen that happening. This is getting extremely sophisticated.
Hmm.
So you've got to think about that from a workflow perspective, because not only are physicians and practitioners documenting that way, but if they select it in the EMR, it's going to come over into billing typically. We don't have a lot of practices left manually entering their information that's flowing
Hmm.
over. Now, I think we should talk some about the fact that there's definitely times that this is identifying issues within a practice or with a particular practitioner, because as frustrated as I am, and I've said this before on this podcast and Sean's on the Compliance Guy Roundtable, I do not agree with auto downcoding at all. This is not an audit. This is not someone,
No,
a person looking at a record and making a determination. They're making an assumption and just seeing what they can get away with. And that's
exactly.
incredibly frustrating. It shouldn't be allowed, but I'm not here to debate the legal side of everything.
No.
So one thing we need to identify is, as frustrating as this is, and as much as we want to fight for fair reimbursement, What about those times where we know that those fives aren't supported?
Hmm.
And,
Or even those
Michelle,
fours.
exactly, even the fours, we could think about, different specialties. I don't know about you, Michelle, but sometimes when I start an audit, let's say pediatrics, for example, there is a massive misunderstanding that pediatrics is automatically a four under the new
Hmm.
guidelines, where we see very high utilization of a four, but yet we start to read the notes and there's little to no risk documented. And there's misunderstandings because people didn't learn the AMA definitions behind our MDM
Hmm.
grid, and they're just assuming, oh, they almost all have systemic symptoms. Oh, I almost always give an antibiotic. Almost every patient's a level four. So, we see these trends in our own audits, but what are your thoughts related to that, Michelle? Because I know that's the outcome of a lot of your audits.
Yeah, I find it a little frustrating, and I think that especially when I know for certain clients we do re-audits, especially when we are on re-audit even 3. If we've had to get to re-audit 3, but I can tell you I have seen re-audit 7 and 8. How did we even get there? Why is this provider not under 100%
Hmm.
review? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, there has to be a a punitive measure in place at some point.
some kind of
These
accountability that they care
Yes,
about.
these providers, while yes, they are there to care for the patients, and they are clinically trained and highly specialized in what they do. None of us are questioning that the work they do is meaningful and that the work that they do is important. But part of your job as well, whether you like it or not, is documenting your encounters for compliant billing. And you don't just get to ignore that because you think you're important or you think you understand the guidelines better or you don't agree with what the guidelines say. That's that's not an option you have. You are still hired to do a job. And part of that job is documenting for compliance and billing. So there has to be a point at which they're called to the carpet and they are held accountable for this poor documentation. I know I just worked on an audit recently where the X-rays are not being documented in a way that's billable. And when reached out to the client, they're like, "Oh, we've talked to them about this and they've given us an earful." And it's like, well, did you do any oversight after you talked to them and followed up with them again and showed them we can't bill any of this? Like that,
Mhm.
it's not an option to give an earful back because you don't want to do it the way you're supposed to. And that's something that I get so frustrated about. Or like when people are like, well, we don't want to use this wording because it sounds too harsh.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you might have
Grow
to
up.
hurt a feeling because you want to know what? Some of these doctors aren't scared to sit down and hurt your feelings. We
Yeah.
have all had those interactions that are highly inappropriate and nobody needs to be subject to, just because you're a physician. But sometimes you just have to be point blank with them and you need to find a professional way to do that. And sometimes that also involves getting others involved from their chain of command and higher up. They need to have that involvement because sometimes it takes their chief of the department coming in and saying, "What are you doing?" You know,
Right.
sometimes you just need that extra support. But I definitely agree. It can be extremely frustrating when you are auditing, you're providing feedback specific to what that provider is doing, and they have the roadmap to fix that. And in all honesty, Stephanie, I feel like um if they just stopped trying to use these templates and trying to
Hmm.
automate documentation, a lot of this would go away and it probably would actually save them a lot of time.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and I think too as well, how many times do we see a level 5 that's denied, or we audit a level 5, and especially in the office setting, that high risk, it's very hard to obtain now under the guidelines.
absolutely.
It's
And
not like just because this patient is difficult or complex, we have a 5. It doesn't work that way.
no.
So there's a lot of misunderstanding. This goes to the point, pretty much everything that we constantly talk about on this podcast.
Mhm.
You need to have external auditing, you need to have external input, you need to hold physicians and practitioners accountable. To your point, Michelle, it doesn't matter if you have, Dr. Smith who doesn't want to pay attention because he
Mhm.
thinks he's special. Well, what is your administration doing about it? He should be on 100% hold. If you don't have internal staff, because a lot of hospitals and organizations want physicians and providers to bill for themselves, then what's your backup plan?
Yep.
There's not excuses to allow this particular behavior. And, this is another thing we're seeing in the industry heavily in 2025, people that are wanting to continue to not focus on compliance,
Mhm.
continue to look at it like this is some kind of option if you choose to pursue it, you're going to get hit anyways
Yep.
because they are, with the use of this technology, they are able to make these assumptions and go through, whether we agree with it or not, with actions that are going to hurt your revenue. And the only way to combat that is to have compliance.
Mhm.
And, I know with some of my members that are asking about it, some of my clients, a part of the compliance plan and the monitoring of those practices is looking at utilization, looking at outliers. What are they like
Absolutely.
to their own peers inside of that organization or within the region? Then
Mhm.
beyond that, what does their documentation look like? Because
Mhm.
we hear a lot, I work with hospitals and organizations all over the US. And how many times do we hear from somebody that, well, their population is different, that their specialty is highly complex, which yes, there are times where that's true. I work with physicians, sometimes they're the only ones who provide that care in their entire state, but
Yeah.
that still doesn't get you past the coding and billing
It
guidelines
doesn't. Yeah.
regardless.
It doesn't translate. There is no guideline that says if you are a super important, highly specialized individual, you get to bill a level 5. Surpass everything, go straight to go, collect your
Yeah.
$200. You know, you know what I mean? It
I
doesn't exist.
I had a physician years and years ago. I don't honestly, I wouldn't say it here. I don't even remember what hospital he was in. But I laugh every time I think about this scenario because his response to his very poor accuracy rates on an audit was that the Mayo Clinic refers to him specifically for their patients. And because of that, he will never bill less than a 5. And I was like, well, I don't know what high horse you're on, but that it's not going to work like this.
Slow
Um,
clap.
well, and sometimes I feel bad when I laugh about these things
I know.
because I don't want to downplay the clinical care
No,
because yes,
absolutely
that
not.
is happening. But for those of us that work as a coder or an auditor, you're probably laughing right along because there's these people who give themselves self-importance and it doesn't work that way.
No.
So at the end of the day, let us help you, let us work with you. There's going to be times where we can't avoid the auto downcoding that's happening, but we could work on making sure that the documentation is there so that we could have a better appeal.
Yeah.
And I do want to finish out with that today, Michelle, talking about the appeal process because there's a lot of organizations that are just kind of rolling over, and it's becoming more of a battle to track these things and appeal these things. What are your thoughts on that particular part?
I mean, you're going to have to you're going to have to be vigilant. and you're going to have to submit the documentation, and you're going to have to identify the errors on your own. So that's kind of the difference here. Auditing helps you correct the errors, whereas this auto downcoding is just delaying it's just delaying your payment and creating more work on
Mhm.
your end. So you're going to have to create some kind of process where you are paying attention to what is sent out versus the payment that you receive. And you can't just rely on, like you said, one way. You're going to have to look at it from a few different angles. I would also like to note that you had talked about utilization review.
Mhm.
um, Utilization review is so important because not only can it identify auto downcoding, but it can also identify other missed revenue opportunities. So if it's not something you're doing already, you need to get out there and start doing that and start familiarizing yourself with what to expect from your providers on a month to month basis, and start there, and then start appealing these auto down codes when you're finding them. Submit the documentation for review. Go through the process. Don't just write it off as it's happened, because the only way to stop this from happening is to get those appeals out there and get those auto down codes overturned.
Well, and one thing that I suggest too, I work with my clients at times to help them create an appeal letter or language that can
Mhm.
be used, because sometimes you have to appeal through portals and you're limited on words you can use, things like
Yeah.
that. But we prep it and get it ready so it's there, showing the stance as to why it shouldn't have happened and what's supported. Now, one thing I will say, if you are finding that you're doing a review, a lot of people are diligent and they're looking at every single one internally that has not paid at the rate. But there's times where you also can't fight back and defend what's in the note. So that is an example of when you need to be going back to that particular physician or practitioner. You should be giving them some insight into the fact that this is happening at this volume in the industry across the US. This isn't
Mhm.
just hit or miss certain specialties. We can't even say only certain codes or certain patient settings this is happening in. It's
Mm-mm.
happening all over. So you want to make sure you're providing that education, talking about, if you have opportunities for monthly meetings with your practitioners, quarterly meetings, maybe newsletter style updates, anything like that. Start to get this information out there because you've got to work on this internally to help combat what's happening externally.
Mhm. Yeah. And I do know a lot of providers are very active in monitoring their their revenue. Just because so many have been paid, like their compensation and
Mhm.
bonuses are based on their work RVUs and stuff. So if they're aware that this is happening, that's just one more eye on it, because they're going to be watching, if they're
Mhm.
already watching their revenue, like I know
Mhm.
some are. And kudos to them, in all honesty. Really, I applaud providers who pay that level of attention, because 100%, I know we talk about the bad actors and we make jokes about the bad actors, but so many providers really do want to provide the best quality they can to their patients, not just in clinical care, but from a financial standpoint. So,
Mhm.
kudos to them. But getting that out there, they could just be another eye on that to see, like, oh, because they're really in tune to their revenue if they're somebody who's tracking that and such, and can help also identify if something like this has happened.
Yep. Right, so we'll go ahead and end it there for today. Just as a quick reminder, at the beginning, we talked about the upcoming webinar events. So you can go to stephanieallerconsulting.com. There is a section specific to webinar events, and you'll see there what Terry Fletcher and I are offering throughout the year. Live events will have one CEU. So definitely check that out. I hope you'll join us and invest some of your educational time and budget and things like that into what we have going on this year. All right, have a good day, and we'll see everybody back next week.